"Sir, we're going to have to charge you $50,000 for non-compliant grass length, an unsanctioned mailbox color, and apparently a suspiciously whimsical garden gnome." That's what the laminated paper said, right above the HOA seal and an actual, no-joke watermark of a bald eagle holding hedge clippers. I read it 3 times while standing barefoot in my driveway, coffee in one hand and disbelief in the other. At first, I thought it was a prank from my brother, who once gift-wrapped my entire living room, but this was real. And that's the moment I realized I was about to start a war I didn't ask for, but one I was absolutely going to win. 3 weeks earlier, I had been minding my own business, enjoying the relatively peaceful life I'd built at the edge of Maple Creek Preserve, a neighborhood that looked like Stepford had a love child with a Pottery Barn catalog. I'm Arthur Art McMillan, a civil engineer who spends more time fixing city infrastructure than worrying about the color of my window shutters. I bought this house 10 years ago after the previous owner, a retired highway contractor, gave me a deal too good to pass up. It came with a yard, a workshop, and one very peculiar clause in the deed. I owned the main road leading into the community. Back then, I didn't think much of it. The road was maintained, the neighbors were quiet, and there were no strings attached. At least, not until a new HOA board took over last year, led by the notorious, power-tripping oxygen thief that was Brenda Vance. Brenda wore mirrored aviators, drove a Range Rover she never fully paid off, and had a voice that could peel paint off a battleship. Her hobby wasn't gardening or yoga, it was control. And unfortunately for me, she had decided I was public enemy number 1. The letter came on a Monday morning. It was hand-delivered by a pimply teenager who looked like he'd been promised a 4-night gift card if he got my signature. He handed it to me with trembling hands and muttered, "Good luck," before fleeing like I was radioactive. I opened the envelope, skimmed the first line, and audibly choked on my coffee. $50,000 in violations for things like plant overgrowth, non-neutral lawn decorations, and this one really hit failure to obtain patio furniture certification. The kicker? I never signed anything that said I was under the HOA. I had zero recollection of agreeing to let these clowns tell me what to do with my grass or my garden gnome, whose name, by the way, is Norman, and who has a better sense of humor than Brenda ever will. Still, I try to be diplomatic. I walked down to the HOA office of beige trailer pretending to be an actual building and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. Naturally, I was met with Brenda herself, flanked by 2 other board members, Gary and Sheila, who looked like they'd been cast as Mall Cop number 2 in a low-budget action movie. Brenda didn't even look up from her desk as I entered. "Oh, Mr. McMillan, finally decided to face the music?" she asked, clicking her pen like a courtroom judge about to sentence me to life without lawn privileges. "I don't think I'm part of your HOA," I replied calmly. "My property isn't listed under the original covenant agreements, and I've never signed any annexation forms." She smiled, the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who just kicked a puppy and found it satisfying. "If you live here, you follow the rules. That's how communities stay beautiful. Except I legally don't have to," I said, placing my own copy of the deed on her desk. She glanced at it, sniffed, and then waved it away like I'd handed her a flyer for a taco truck. "Rules are rules," she said. "And if you want to contest the fines, you'll need to file a petition with the board, which we'll review next quarter." That's when it clicked. This wasn't about grass or gnomes or mailbox colors. This was about power. Brenda was trying to make an example out of me. Unfortunately for her, she'd picked the wrong guy to push. I walked out of that office and drove straight to the county recorder's office. Within 2 hours, I had a certified copy of my deed, which clearly stated like a glowing sword of truth in an HOA dungeon of lies that the road leading into Maple Creek Preserve was, in fact, privately owned by yours truly. My predecessor had built it himself back in the 70s and never transferred ownership. The HOA had been using it freely for nearly 2 decades without paying a dime. No easement, no lease, nothing. I sat in my truck, staring at the document, grinning like I just found buried treasure. Because technically I had. At that moment, something in me snapped, but in a good way. The same kind of snap that happens when you're pushed too far and realize you don't have to take it anymore. I didn't just want to fight back. I want to make a statement so bold, so hilarious, so infuriatingly legal that Brenda would regret the day she sent me that invoice. So I call my Uncle Lou, a retired contractor and prank war veteran, and said, "Hey, remember that toll booth you built for your driveway in '98? Think we could make a version 2.0?" He laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You serious?" "Dead serious." By the next morning, plans were in motion. We sourced an old-fashioned toll booth shell from a retired amusement park, rewired it with a license plate scanner, and installed a retractable gate arm with solar power backup. It was beautiful. It was petty. It was legal. Before I installed anything, I made sure to run it all through a lawyer, Eleanor, who nearly spit out her coffee when she read my deed. "You're telling me the HOA charged you 50 grand while they've been squatting on your road for free?" "Yep. Want to charge them back rent?" "Not yet. I want to start with a toll." That weekend, while the HOA board was busy planning their spring uniformity walkthrough, I was setting concrete footers and digging trenches for wiring. I posted signs a week in advance. Private road. Toll begins Monday. $3 per entry. Board members $15. I even offered a free resident sticker if people signed a waiver stating they agreed I was not under HOA jurisdiction. That part? Pure gold. Monday morning arrived. I stood by the booth with a coffee in hand, Norman the gnome beside me, and watched as Brenda's Range Rover screeched to a halt in front of the gate. Her mouth dropped open. She honked. I smiled and waved. She rolled down her window and shouted, "You can't do this." "Oh, but I can," I said, tapping the laminated sign. "Rules are rules, remember?" The sound of Brenda's horns still echoed through the neighborhood like a dying goose when the first car pulled up behind her. A blue minivan driven by Mr. Peterson, the retired gym teacher who always wore socks with sandals, slowed to a confused stop behind her SUV. He leaned out the window and squinted at the toll booth, then at me, then back at the laminated sign that read, "Private road. Toll begins today." Brenda flailed her arms out the driver's window like she was directing a runway landing, but all she did was stir confusion. I could see the panic bubbling in her perfectly contoured face as she realized the rest of the neighborhood was about to see her tantrum in high definition. I leaned against the booth, casually sipping my coffee while the license plate reader beeped softly and logged each vehicle. Every car that passed was logged, timed, and charged accordingly. Residents who had already come by the previous day to grab one of the "I am not under HOA control" stickers drove through for free, waving at me and even tossing me snacks like I was running a roadside lemonade stand. Brenda, however, was stuck in her own echo chamber of rage, refusing to move forward or backward. Behind her, the honking began. "You've blocked the road, Brenda," I called out cheerfully. "People have places to be." "This is illegal," she shouted, stepping out of her car with the energy of a furious goose. "You can't charge people to use a neighborhood road. You might want to check the county records," I replied, holding up the very document her HOA had ignored for years. I own the road. Always have. And until now, I didn't mind sharing it. But then I got slapped with a $50,000 invoice for decorative gnomes and unpatriotic patio cushions. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at me, practically vibrating with rage. "You're extorting the community." Extortion? That's rich coming from someone who charges $100 for a fence panel being half an inch too tall. I gestured toward the camera mounted just above the booth. "Everything here is recorded. It's fully permitted. No one's being forced to pay. They just can't trespass without permission anymore." That was the first day Brenda truly lost her composure. She screamed about lawsuits, city codes, neighborhood unity, and the downfall of civilization as we know it. And yet, one by one, the residents drove around her and paid the modest toll $3 for everyone but HOA board members, who were charged $15. That number wasn't random. It was poetic. It was what Brenda charged Mrs. Diaz for non-conforming Halloween decorations last year, specifically a single rubber bat on her porch. Call it karmic pricing. Later that afternoon, I checked my newly created toll control app and smiled. Dozens of cars had already passed through. Even better, a few neighbors had slipped notes under the booth door. One read, "About time someone stood up to them." Another simply said, "Bless you, toll master." That one came with homemade cookies. The next day, the HOA struck back. It started with a compliance inspection. Brenda and her two favorite minions, Gary, who looked like a substitute math teacher with a superiority complex, and Sheila, who wore HOA-branded polo shirts to dinner, marched onto my property without knocking. I only knew because my driveway camera pinged me with an alert. Suspicious activity detected. I watched live as Brenda pointed at my bushes, Sheila scribbled furiously on a clipboard, and Gary actually measured the height of my hedges using a ruler he'd clearly brought from home. By the time I stepped outside, they were snapping photos of my garage door. "May I help you trespassers with something?" I asked, loud enough for the camera to pick up. Brenda whirled around. "We're conducting a standard visual inspection for new violations. Except I'm not under your jurisdiction," I reminded her, holding up the waiver she'd already seen. "I've asked you to stay off my property. This is your last warning." She huffed and waved the clipboard like it held the Ten Commandments. "We have authority granted by the HOA charter, and I have a police report ready to file for trespassing and harassment," I replied calmly. "Now, smile for the camera." Brenda's face twisted in a snarl that could have melted vinyl siding, and Sheila nervously whispered something about, "Maybe we should go." They left without another word, but I knew this wasn't over. Brenda was the kind of person who didn't stop at losing. She doubled down until the whole table caught fire. The next morning, I found flyers taped to every mailbox, including mine. "Community alert, unauthorized toll booth," they screamed in bold red letters. "Dangerous individual operating illegal business on private road." The best part? At the bottom of the flyer was a link to Brenda's personal blog, where she'd written a 2,000-word post calling me an urban menace and compared me to a pirate toll collector from the 1800s. I posted a screenshot of her blog to the neighborhood Facebook group with one caption: $50,000 in fake fines versus $3 toll. You decide who the menace is. The comments section exploded. Half the neighborhood came to my defense, sharing their own stories of petty fines, endless rules, and Brenda's power trip. A few brave souls even publicly announced they were refusing to pay their HOA dues until the board changed leadership. Brenda, naturally, began deleting comments and blocking people faster than you could say neighborhood coup. In response to the online heat, Brenda doubled the HOA fees to cover legal consultation, which only enraged people more. I sweetened the deal. Anyone who opted out of the HOA entirely by signing a legal withdrawal form got a lifetime toll exemption. Within 48 hours, I had a line of neighbors outside my booth, pens in hand, ready to be free. The cherry on top came that weekend. A guy in a lifted truck tried to bypass the toll by cutting across the grass next to my booth. He didn't realize I'd installed tire spikes disguised as decorative rocks. Yes, decorative. The loud pop, pop, of two blown-out tires echoed through the neighborhood, followed by a wail of disbelief as he stepped out and found a laminated sign on the spikes. "Smile. You're on candid camera. Please pay at the booth." That video, it went viral on the local subreddit. Within days, I was a meme, toll troll, Lord of the Road, Art the Just. Brenda's name, meanwhile, became a verb. Don't get Brended, people joked. And yet, even with the entire community turning against her, she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next move she made would shake the neighborhood, stir up a decades-old secret, and push this petty feud into full-blown warfare. But me? I was just getting started. It started with an unmarked van parked at the edge of the neighborhood just before sunrise. At first glance, it looked like a contractor's vehicle ladder rack on top, magnetic signs that said utility survey. But something about it felt off. Maybe it was the fact that the same van had been parked near my booth 3 days in a row, or maybe it was that I caught a glimpse of Brenda talking to the driver the day before, gesturing wildly while holding a clipboard. Whatever the reason, my gut said trouble, and I'd learned by now not to ignore that instinct, especially when it came to anything with Brenda's fingerprints on it. By noon, I had my answer. My mailbox was stuffed with a legal envelope so thick it had its own gravitational pull. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the HOA's freshly hired legal team. They claimed the toll booth was interfering with neighborhood operations, infringing upon communal rights, and my personal favorite, creating an atmosphere of hostility and revenue theft. Revenue theft? From a private road that I owned? I laughed so hard I had to sit down. But the letter wasn't just for show. Brenda had managed to whip up enough fake concern to convince the board to take official action. They filed a lawsuit in small claims court demanding I remove the toll booth, pay restitution for emotional distress, and cease all unauthorized use of HOA infrastructure, as if the road I'd legally owned for 10 years suddenly belonged to them because she said so. The gall was impressive, if not delusional. Rather than panic, I poured a whiskey, sat on the porch, and called my lawyer, Eleanor, a no-nonsense woman who once sued an airline for putting too much ice in her drink and won. After reading the letter, she let out a low whistle. "This is desperate," she said. "Also, I hope they like countersuits." Eleanor filed the paperwork within hours. Not only did we contest their claim, but we also hit them with a countersuit for back rent. 18 years of unauthorized road usage, adjusted for inflation and market value, totaling $187,000. She attached the property deed, aerial maps, historical maintenance logs, and a city engineer's letter confirming the road's private status. It was like watching a legal nuke get armed in real time. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was in flames. Someone, definitely not me, had leaked screenshots of the court filings. Residents were floored. Most had no idea the road had ever been private. They just assumed it was part of the HOA bubble they'd all inherited. Some were furious they'd been lied to for so long. Others were more impressed than mad. One post read, "Brenda charged me $50 for improper garbage bin alignment, and this guy hits her back with $187K? I'm buying this man a steak." The next few days were chaos. Brenda started holding late-night meetings with the remaining board members, Gary and Sheila, both of whom were now clearly in over their heads. I knew because I sent up my drone. Yep, I had a drone. It was meant for inspecting my workshop's roof, but lately it served as airborne surveillance. From 100 feet up, I watched as Brenda pointed at maps and legal docs on her patio table, her face glowing under citronella candles like a villain plotting her last stand. Their grand plan, it turned out, was to create a bypass. According to a very shaky sketch I later obtained through a neighbor's son, who attended the meeting for free pizza, Brenda wanted to cut a new road through the side of the neighborhood, across a strip of land owned by the city. Her logic was simple. If she couldn't remove my toll booth, she'd render it irrelevant. Except there was just one problem. That land was protected green space. As in, can't build on it protected. Brenda had apparently skipped that part in her plan and already hired a sketchy paving crew to clear a path. The morning they showed up with spray paint and measuring tape, I made a single phone call to the city's zoning department. I didn't even have to explain much. I just forwarded them a screenshot of Brenda's map and the drone footage of her crew laying out stakes. The city showed up 20 minutes later. Permits were denied. Crew sent home. Brenda got a fine for unauthorized excavation. It was beautiful. And yet, she still wouldn't give up. She turned to public shaming. She started mailing letters to every house in the neighborhood titled "The Toll Tyrant's True Agenda." They claimed I was building a private empire and holding residents hostage for personal profit. She included a graph showing projected toll revenue over 10 years, as if I was planning to build a mansion shaped like a coin slot. She even tried to spin the legal counterclaim as an attack on community values. This time, I didn't have to respond. The community did it for me. A group of neighbors, fed up with Brenda's antics and inspired by the sudden awareness that their dues were funding this madness, created a petition to recall the entire HOA board. They went door to door, explaining how the HOA had never had legal authority over my property, how the road had been misused for years, and how Brenda was now doubling their dues to pay for a legal meltdown. I sweetened the deal again. Anyone who signed the petition got a golden Fast Pass sticker for the toll booth priority lane access, no wait times, and a free coffee every Saturday morning from the little booth cafe I had started just for fun. Yes, I turned the toll booth into a drive-through coffee spot on weekends. If I was on a run of rebellion, it might as well include espresso. Within 5 days, over half the neighborhood had signed the petition. Brenda, now cornered and increasingly erratic, called an emergency HOA meeting. She screamed about outsiders, lawbreakers, and how she would not be dethroned by a toll goblin and his little gnome sidekick. She meant Norman, my gnome. He'd become a bit of a neighborhood mascot by then. Someone had even crocheted him a cape. During the meeting, someone live-streamed Brenda's meltdown. The video hit the local Facebook scene like wildfire. Comments poured in. She really said toll goblin? I can't. I would pay triple to drive through that toll booth now. Brenda needs a vacation. Like from Earth. By the end of the week, the writing was on the wall. Brenda was losing control. The residents were organizing. The city was watching. The HOA's budget was evaporating in legal fees. But instead of retreating gracefully, she did what all delusional despots do when the walls start closing in. She went nuclear. And that's when the plot twisted again, harder and faster than I ever saw coming. Because Brenda wasn't just clinging to power, she was about to commit a felony. The first clue something was off came in the form of tire tracks. Not just any tire tracks, but fresh ones, pressed deep into the dirt beside my toll booth in the middle of the night. I found them the next morning while restocking the little coffee station I'd set up, complete with an espresso machine, donuts, and my now famous toll goblin blend. At first, I figured it was someone turning around, maybe a lost delivery driver. But the tracks led off the road and around to the back of the booth, where, to my surprise, the security panel had been tampered with. Wires were cut, and the license plate camera had been yanked clean off its mount and thrown into the bushes like a banana peel. This wasn't a vandal being random. Someone had come with a plan. I reviewed the security footage, but the camera that covered that angle had mysteriously gone offline around 3 a.m. I checked the backup generator and found it disconnected clean-cut, like it had been done with wire cutters by someone who knew exactly what to target. I stood there, staring at the frayed ends, and a slow-burning realization crept in. This wasn't just sabotage. This was retaliation. Brenda had gone from passive-aggressive fines to full-blown felony mode, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the opening act. Sure enough, that afternoon, I got a call from Officer Riley, the same cop who'd responded during the early toll booth dispute. Art, he said, we got a report about heavy equipment moving through your road overnight. You authorize any contractors recently? Nope, I replied, feeling my stomach drop. Well, he said, we found a backhoe parked behind lot 42. No permits, no company logo, and it looks like someone was trying to dig a trench right where the new road bypass would have gone. We're pulling surveillance from the city cams now, but I thought you should know. I hung up and stared down the street toward lot 42, which happened to be a vacant plot owned by Brenda's cousin. It was all starting to make sense. If they couldn't legally build a bypass, they'd just do it illegally and hope to deal with the consequences later. Or never, if they played their cards right. But now there were criminal charges in play. Unauthorized excavation, destruction of private property, tampering with security equipment. It was piling up fast. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for that night, and though I was never technically invited, I decided to show up. I figured if Brenda wanted to play this in the shadows, I'd drag it right into the daylight. The community center was already buzzing when I arrived. Residents clustered in tight circles, murmuring in low voices. The room quieted when I stepped in, and Brenda, standing at the front with her trademark binder of doom, narrowed her eyes like I was a cockroach she'd thought she'd crushed days ago. Arthur McMillan, she said, voice dripping with venom. You're not a member of this HOA and have no business. I'm here as the owner of the road you've been using illegally for nearly 2 decades, I interrupted, and more recently, as the victim of sabotage and criminal trespass. Care to explain the backhoe, Brenda? She blinked, caught off guard. And for the first time in months, she didn't have a snappy reply. Instead, Gary stepped forward, clearing his throat. We thought we had permission to improve the infrastructure. The community was concerned about congestion at the toll booth. Interesting, I said, pulling a folded document from my jacket. Because the city, says otherwise. No permit, no approval. And according to Officer Riley, your little construction crew trespassed on my land. Again, I laid the paperwork on the table, where it sat like a live grenade. Brenda's face flushed a deep, angry red. This is harassment, she hissed. You're trying to destroy this community with your tolls and your fake lawsuits. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. Not after weeks of toll booth coffee, public legal filings, and Brenda's meltdown going viral. Mrs. Chun, who'd lived in the neighborhood since its founding, stood up from the second row. You're the one who's been lying, Brenda, she said. You charged my granddaughter $200 because her bike leaned against the wrong fence. And now you're trying to secretly build roads on land you don't own? We've had enough. Others chimed in, each telling their own version of HOA overreach. Fines for garden flags, for flower colors, even for kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. It was like a collective exhale of frustration that had been building for years and was finally exploding. Brenda's lip trembled, but she wasn't done. She reached for her folder and pulled out a letter, waving it in the air like a victory flag. I have legal representation, she declared. My cousin is a judge, and he's preparing an injunction to shut down this illegal toll scheme once and for all. A long silence followed. Then I pulled out my phone, tapped a few buttons, and projected an image onto the room screen using the center's Bluetooth display. It was a news article, disgraced former county judge disbarred in 2007. A mugshot. Same last name, same face. Your cousin hasn't practiced law in almost 20 years, I said deadpan. And he was disbarred for falsifying traffic citations. So unless you're planning to go back in time, that argument's not going to save you. Gasps filled the room. Brenda clutched the folder to her chest like it might stop her from collapsing. Gary and Sheila exchanged horrified looks, realizing they'd hitched their wagon to a derailed train. Then came the moment no one expected. Officer Riley entered the meeting hall, accompanied by another officer and a plainclothes investigator. He walked straight to Brenda. Brenda Vance, we have a warrant for your arrest, he said. Charges include trespassing, destruction of private property, misuse of community funds, and conspiracy to commit unpermitted construction on protected land. She gawked at him, speechless for the first time since I'd met her. You can't be serious, she finally whispered. We are, Riley said. You can come quietly, or we can add resisting. Brenda looked around, as if hoping someone would step in. But no one moved. No one spoke. Even Sheila backed away, hands in the air like she wanted nothing to do with it. As the officers escorted her out, I caught her eye. She looked at me with pure hatred, like I'd stolen something from her. But I didn't steal anything. I just took back what was always mine. After she was gone, the room buzzed with stunned silence. It was over. The queen had fallen, or so I thought, because the HOA, while now headless and hollow, still had one last card to play, a loophole buried deep in the original community covenant, one that Brenda had never dared to touch, but that her cronies might just be desperate enough to try. The week after Brenda's arrest was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that creeps in after a storm when the air still smells like lightning and everyone walks around as if waiting for something else to fall from the sky. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, of course. People speculated about how long she'd be gone, whether she'd try to slither back in once the charges were dropped, and what would happen to the HOA now that their self-appointed queen had been dethroned. But while most people were ready to move on and start fresh, I knew better than to celebrate too early. Brenda might have been out of the picture, but her mess still lingered like the aftertaste of expired cottage cheese. For one thing, the HOA wasn't officially dead. Not yet. Gary and Sheila had assumed temporary leadership, clinging to the skeleton of power like two raccoons squabbling over a discarded sandwich. I figured they'd be too embarrassed to make a move, especially after being publicly humiliated at the last meeting, but embarrassment was clearly not in their vocabulary. They were desperate, wounded, and under pressure from the handful of loyalists still clinging to the idea that I was the villain. Which is probably why, one foggy Monday morning, I found a formal notice duct taped to the front of my toll booth. It was printed on HOA letterhead and titled, Emergency Infrastructure Annexation. According to the document, the HOA board had invoked a clause buried in the original community charter one that gave the board authority to annex adjacent infrastructure in the event of a community access crisis. And they claimed the toll booth qualified as a crisis. In short, they were trying to seize my road. I laughed for a full minute before calling Eleanor. She wasn't amused. Actually, Art, this clause might hold some weight, she said, flipping through the ancient, scanned copy of the HOA charter that she'd pulled from the county archive. If the road had ever been formally incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction, it might have legs. But it wasn't, I said. That's the key, she replied. The burden's on them to prove otherwise. And unless they've been hiding something. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to, because that night I found out they had been. I received an anonymous email from an address that looked fake, something like NeighborWatcher47 at a burner domain. No body text, just one attachment. I opened it cautiously, expecting a badly photoshopped image of me stealing mailboxes. Instead, it was a scanned document, a forged easement agreement dated 5 years ago with my signature. Only I'd never signed it. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what this was. Brenda, or someone under her direction, had created a fake document claiming I had granted the HOA full rights to use and manage the road. It was a weak forgery, full of typos and a signature that looked like it had been traced by a raccoon with a crayon. But if they submitted it to the county and no one challenged it, it could become a legal nightmare. I called Eleanor again. She nearly shouted through the phone. This is felony fraud, Art. You need to go public. Now. So I did. I printed out copies of the forged document, annotated with red markers, and highlighted comparisons of my real signature versus the fake one. I stapled the sheets to a bulletin board and rolled it out to the toll booth the next morning like a mobile exhibit. People lined up to see it, jaws dropping, heads shaking. Even the skeptical residents who had grumbled about my tolls were now firmly in my corner. Then I took it one step further. I called the local news station. By sunset, Channel 8 was parked in front of my house, camera rolling as I explained how the HOA had tried to fabricate an easement, seize a road they had no legal claim to, and silence the one guy who stood up to them. The news anchor ate it up. They even did a side-by-side zoom on the signatures, complete with dramatic background music. The story aired that night under the headline, Toll Booth Tyranny or HOA Fraud? The Battle of Maple Creek Preserve. Gary and Sheila didn't respond publicly, but I could feel the heat closing in. The next day, a certified letter arrived at my door from the HOA's law firm. Only it wasn't a threat this time. It was a settlement offer. They were willing to formally relinquish all claims to the road and dissolve the HOA entirely if I agreed to drop any pending legal action. Eleanor advised me to play hardball. They're cooked, Art, she said. You could sue for damages, back tolls, emotional distress. But I was tired. I didn't want a drawn-out court battle. I wanted peace. So I counter-offered. I dropped everything, no lawsuits, no fines, no prison time if they issued a formal public apology, reimbursed my legal fees, and signed over exclusive, permanent access rights to the road. 3 days later, I stood on the neighborhood commons, coffee in hand, while Gary shakily read the apology into a microphone. Behind him, Sheila avoided eye contact, her cheeks the color of raw salmon. We, the former board members of the Maple Creek Preserve HOA, formally acknowledged that we acted outside our legal authority and that Arthur McMillan, owner of the main access road, was wrongfully targeted. We hereby dissolve the board and apologize to Mr. McMillan and the residents of this community. There was no applause, just a long, collective sigh. But that was enough. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to change. Lawn gnomes popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. People painted their mailboxes rainbow colors. One guy even installed a windmill on his roof for no reason other than because it looks cool. And my toll booth? It stayed right where it was. But I gave it facelift. Now it served free coffee on weekends, hosted small neighborhood events, and had a rotating playlist of Brenda's greatest quotes, auto-tuned and remixed by a local teenager into a surprisingly catchy EDM track. Norman the gnome got a little pedestal next to the booth, complete with a plaque, Defender of the Road, Protector of Property Rights. One sunny Saturday, a kid biked past and asked if the toll was still real. I smiled and said, "Only if your HOA ever comes back." He laughed and rode on. The war was over, not with fireworks or grand speeches, but with something even better: freedom, community, and the sweetest revenge of all living well while your enemies fade into irrelevance. And as I sat there, sipping coffee under a handmade banner that read Brenda Free Zone, I realized something. Sometimes all it takes to bring down a tyrant is a toll booth, a stubborn streak, and a garden gnome named Norman.